In the mid-1900s, deep within the archives of the American Central Intelligence Agency, known worldwide as the CIA, lay hidden a classified document which mentions a country whose name has become but a myth. The mere mention of Tartaria invites a kaleidoscope of perspectives. Some theorists suggest a civilization harnessing free energy, a secret guarded by the hands of power. A realm where ancient Tartarians harness boundless energy, concealed from the world for generations. Yet skepticism still echoes. Free energy from a lost civilization, a fantastical conspiracy, or a concealed truth? For some, Tartaria remains elusive, a phantom civilization absent from historical records. But what if Tartaria transcends myth? Some propose it as the medieval name for the Mongol Empire, a reinterpretation that adds a new layer to our understanding of a bygone era, challenging the annals of history and accepted academia. However, one thing can be certain. Tartaria was clearly mentioned in this CIA document. This document, titled National Cultural Development Under Communism, was first published in June of 1957 and was immediately classified. It was approved for release on the 24th of August, 1999. It starts with a proclamation issued on the 7th of December 1917 by the Bolsheviks. It reads, Muslims of Russia, Tatars of the Volga and the Crimea, Kyrgyz and Sarts of Siberia and Turkestan, Turks and Tatars of Transcaucasia, Chechens and mountain peoples of the Caucasus, and all you whose mosques and prayer houses have been destroyed, whose beliefs and customs have been trampled upon by the Tsars and the oppressors of Russia. Henceforth, your beliefs and customs, your national and cultural institutions are forever free and inviolate. Organize your national life in complete freedom. This is your right. The Bolsheviks had realized that if their revolution was to be a complete success, and if they were to be able to consolidate their newly won power, the support of Russia's minority peoples, including the Muslims, was essential. As well as this, Lenin and Stalin promised equality and sovereignty of all nations of Russia, the right of nations to free self-determination, including the right to secede and form independent states, abolition of all national and national religious privileges and restrictions whatsoever, and freedom of development for the national minorities and ethnographic groups inhabiting the territory of Russia. Unfortunately, for the many peoples of Russia, they had no idea just how little the Bolshevik promises actually meant. This document further alludes to the many ways in which the communists then suppressed the Muslims and other minorities and minority religious groups within Russia. The history of the communists during the 40 years they have been in power in the Soviet Union shows that self-determination has not been the only subject on which they've betrayed both their promises and their alleged doctrine. In the Muslim regions of Russia, Islam was the hearthstone around which the life of its devotees revolved, or rather, did revolve, until the communists violated their promises and made it impossible for Muslims to perform their religious duties. As we've seen, the November 1917 proclamation promised Muslims that they would be free to continue in practice of their faith. A decree on the separation of church from state issued on the 5th of February 1918 declared in Article 3 that every citizen may profess any religion or none. In Article 5 that free practice of religious rights is guaranteed, and in Article 9 that citizens may teach and study religion privately. Once the communists had consolidated their power, they began to reveal their true nature, to violate their earlier promises, and to take repressive acts. Lands belonging to mosques were confiscated by a decree in 1918. Muslim religious brotherhoods were outlawed during the period 1921 to 1922, and a campaign was launched to ridicule Islam and to undermine the influence of the spiritual leaders of the Muslim people. In 1929, measures were enacted that made the active religious life of Islamic worshippers virtually impossible. Islamic leadership was eliminated by the arrest and deportation, if not liquidation, of almost all persons enjoying any religious status. Nearly all village and most city mosques were closed. Religious literature was suppressed through the changing of alphabets, the confiscation of existing religious texts, including the Quran, and the suppression of all publications of a religious nature, and anyone in a responsible position was dismissed if known to be a pious and practicing Muslim. Muslims were to be free to practice their beliefs and customs. That was the Bolshevik promise. In 1917, when the communists came to power, there were 7,000 mosques in European Russia alone, in addition to the unnumbered thousands in Muslim Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Transcaucasia, as well as the Crimea. But in 1942, the communists themselves admitted that there were then only 1,312 mosques in the whole of the Soviet Union. The others had been confiscated and converted into warehouses or stores or otherwise desecrated or allowed to fall into ruin. In Tashkent, for example, where once 300 mosques graced the city before the communists came to power, there were only 20 left. Samarkand, which formerly had over 100 and was the seat of Tamerlane's Tartarian Empire, had only 17 left, of which only one was permitted to be used. Bukhara, an independent Tartarian city which once boasted of 360 mosques, was also reduced to just one. Alma-Ata, a Muslim town for centuries and the capital of the Muslim Republic of Kazakhstan, had not left one single mosque, nor any to be found in large Muslim centers such as Krasnovodsk, Ashgabat, or Stalinabad. The fact was that the communists condemned and therefore prevented the publication of all Muslim literary works except those few which extol the virtues of Russia and the Russians. The document then goes on to mention Tartaria. Or, let us take the matter of history, which along with religion, language and literature constitute the core of a people's cultural heritage. Here again, the communists have interfered in a shameless manner. For example, on the 9th of August 1944, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, sitting in Moscow, issued a directive ordering the party's Tatar Provincial Committee to proceed to a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria, to liquidate serious shortcomings and mistakes of a nationalistic character committed by individual writers and historians in dealing with Tatar history. In other words, Tatar history was to be rewritten, let us be frank, was to be falsified, in order to eliminate references to great Russian aggressions and to hide the facts of the real course of Tatar-Russian relations. And this was no isolated case. In every Muslim area within the USSR, historians, on orders of the Communist Party, have rewritten history to distort the facts so that the Russians appear always in a good light. Needless to say, histories which present the facts truthfully have been withdrawn and destroyed, so that the present and future generations of Muslims are forever denied the chance of learning the true facts of their nation's past. So in this document, the writer, discussing historical events, has expressed concern about the interference of communists, particularly the Communist Party in the USSR, in shaping the narrative of history. The writer cites a specific instance in 1944 when the Communist Party directed a revision of Tartarian history to eliminate references to Russian aggression, suggesting a deliberate falsification of historical facts. The writer contends that this manipulation of history extends beyond Tartaria to all Muslim areas within the USSR, with the intent to portray Russians favorably. Additionally, the writer notes that truthful historical accounts have been withdrawn and destroyed, preventing present and future generations of Muslims and Tatars alike from learning the genuine facts about their nation's past. It is also extremely important to note how vital such a document like this is to be naming Tartaria as a country in the 1950s. The speaker highlights a pattern of interference by the Communist Party and the Russians in shaping the historical narrative, particularly in Muslim and Tatar areas within the USSR. The directive to revise Tartarian history and eliminate references to Russian aggression suggests a deliberate effort to manipulate historical facts. The broader assertion is that this trend extends beyond Tartaria, with historians rewriting history to portray Russians in a positive manner. This document emphasizes the removal and destruction of truthful historical accounts, denying present and future generations the opportunity to learn the genuine facts about our world's history. As we reflect on these concerns, it raises questions about the impact of such historical manipulation on cultural heritage and the understanding of complex relationships between different communities. The deliberate alteration of historical narrative poses challenges to the pursuit of truth and the preservation of diverse cultural identities. This message underscores the importance of critical examination and preservation of authentic historical records to ensure a comprehensive understanding of the past for generations to come. So this book that we're going to be having a look at, A Most Complete Compendium of Geography, it was released by Lawrence Icard in 1691, this original from the British Library. So this book in itself contains a lot of information that you can find elsewhere. There are other documents that have exactly the same stuff. This is an example of that. From 1715, a new description of the world, delineating Europe, Africa, Asia, and America. And there's many more, so I just searched for one of the words, which is another word for Uzbek-Zagathe, and you can find all these different books that have references to exactly the same geography stuff. So they've all copied from the same sources. They do have slight differences. So an example would be from this one. We'll see that it talks about the 85th degree. And if we come over to this book here, the one that we're going to be reading from, it says the 83rd and 180th degree, whereas the other one was 85th and 182nd. 85th and 182nd. It's between the same latitude, 39th and 72nd. But we're going to be talking about this, so you can check these documents out for yourself, see what you think. But we're going to be going over this first document, just going to be seeing what it's saying, having a look on the map where that would be. So, Tartary is the greatest country in the world, lying on the east of Russia and the north of Persia, India, and China. Situated between the 83rd and the 180th degree of longitude and between the 39th and 72nd degree of latitude, being in length from the borders of Astrakhan to the eastern parts of Cathay, about 4,000 miles, and the breadth from the southern parts of Moranara, which is Zagathe or Uzbek, to the most northern parts of Tartaria Deserta, which is essentially the name for Siberia, which is about 2,000 miles. This contains the ancient provinces of Scythia, Sake, Sogdania, and the greatest part of Sarmatia Asiatica, with a little of old Persia. It has remained unconquered under several governments until anno 1162. The Tartars, an obscure people, overran this country and elected a monarchy which still remains, but a good part of it has fallen away. So again, this document was written in 1690. So in 1690, the Tartars still have their monarchy in Tartary, but most of it has fallen away. So that makes sense because in our other videos, we've gone over the Russian or Muscovite conquest of the Tartaria areas. The emperor is called the Great Sham of Tartary, who is also the famous country of China. So it's saying that the Tartars own China in 1691. That would make sense. We know the Tartars retook China in the 1600s, 1644. They officially became the rulers with the Qing dynasty. The Ming dynasty beforehand were having issues. There was a peasants' revolt in Beijing, and at that point the Mings asked the kings, or the Qings, to come and assist them, and that's when the Qing dynasty moved in. So going back to the document, the emperor is called the Great Sham of Tartary, who has also the famous country of China. Some part of it is under the Russians, the rest under several independent princes. The imperial seat is at Shambalu, as it is supposed. So this is important because Shambalu, we're going to have a look as a lot of references to it being Peking, but it's not Peking, it's a different city. We'll see some references for that just to prove that point. But we've got other videos about this, but the official line is that Shambalu is Beijing or Peking. A quick Google search will show you that Kambalu is Kanbalik or Dadu of Wan, which was the winter capital of the Wan dynasty in now Beijing, the capital of China. You see Kambalu, an alternative form of Kambaluk, comes from Marco Polo's travels, but it's not just Marco Polo, there's other people that talk about it. Marco Polo is the one they like to reference the most, and he apparently visited Kanbalik, which in East Turkish means city of the Khan, which, as we saw, is supposedly Kanbalik in Beijing. We can easily disprove this one. All we have to do is have a look where Beijing is, and we can see Beijing right here is behind the Great Wall of China. So this is where Beijing is, and Beijing was apparently conquered by Kublai Khan and he supposedly called it Cambaluc, which was its name forever afterwards. However, if we come to this book called The History of Tamerlane the Great, taken out of Alicent, the Emperor's Historian, so this is by his historian himself. This book was printed in 1679. It seems to have been translated, original documents, probably around the 1600s. And Timur is from 1336 to 1405. So we can see from this book, just from the table of contents, some of the things that Tamerlane does. He has a war with the Muscovites, has a war against the King of China. But before he can have a war against the King of China, he is stopped by the revolt of Calix, a great lord of Tartary. So this is before he goes against the King of China. And here it talks on page 35. Calix had been with his army of 100,000 men before the great and proud city of Cambalu, the metropolis of the province of Cathay. The inhabitants had opened their gates and received him with as much joy as if he had been their lawful sovereign. However, Tamerlane, who comes from Zagatay or Chagatai, which is to the west, he comes and he fights Calix and he takes Cambalu. And this book talks more about it, you can see. 14 mentions of Cambalu. And this is before he invades China. So let's have a look at the invasion of China. And as soon as it begins, it says the provinces of Liaotum and of Pekin. Pekin, of course, is Beijing, which the Chinese had taken from the Tartarians, were the causes of that anger and displeasure, which they could not dissemble. So, of course, Pekin had been taken from them in the terms of Kublai Khan had taken it himself, or built it himself as Khan Balik, not Cambalu. These are different places. He'd built Khan Balik, but the Chinese had taken it back with the Ming dynasty, and Tamerlane was trying to re-establish the One dynasty, the Tartars, which the Chinese had taken from the Tartarians, were the causes of that anger and displeasure, which they could not disassemble. They found themselves by this means, and by a prodigious wall of a vast length, built in the passage of the mountains, deprived of the benefit of that prey which they were wont to make in that kingdom by their frequent inroads. So it's talking about the Great Wall of China. Pekin, Beijing, in the Great Wall of China. So a simple deduction. How did Tamerlane manage to capture Cambaluc or Cambalu from Calix to then move south across the wall to then capture Cambalu again? If it's Pekin, if it's Beijing, if this is right, if the claims that Wikipedia made, or the official narrative makes, an example is here. You can see that from the travels of Marco Polo on this Khan Academy, when they quote this point, in this city of Cambalu, another spelling for Khan Balik. You'll find this in all the old books as well. They've not the originals, obviously, but in the more recent translations, it'll say down below, Cambalu is just Kambalik, it just means Beijing. So if we come to the third chapter, the one before this, where it talks about Calix, you can see there are two mentions of a wall. However, those mentions of the wall, when Tamerlane had privately made mentions for preparations for an expedition that he'd promised his uncle, the uncle being the emperor, he had promised this expedition. So basically, Tamerlane says to his uncle that he's going to go and attack China. The king of this large country, who is named the offspring of the sun, expected no such matter. And you see, when talking of China, these lands are lying beyond a river called Tachi, and beyond that famous wall which bound both empires, and which the king of China built to secure himself and his people from the Tartarians. The next mention of the wall, nevertheless, he was willing that Calix should believe that he was passed beyond the mountains to assault the famous wall defended by all the armies of the Chineses. So it's saying Tamerlane wanted Calix to believe that he was already beyond the mountains and he was attacking the Chinese at the wall. So he's talking about the Chinese at the wall, right here. If Calix was at Cambalu, which is the metropolis of the province of Cathay, if Calix is at Cambalu, how the hell is Cambalu also Peking? Because Tamerlane hasn't even gone there yet, and they talk about the wall. The only mentions of the wall, which is pretty easy to understand, so I hope I've explained it decently well, but just have a look. If this is Beijing, all right, and we're somewhere outside Beijing, and they're telling us that Beijing is Cambalu, it's the same place. So this Tartarian king is apparently living in Beijing, in exactly the same place as the Emperor of China. No problems, they're not arguing or anything. They apparently both live in the same city and don't understand it. So Tamerlane wants to cross this wall to take over Beijing. And on the way to take over Beijing, somebody revolts. Now, history is trying to tell us that Beijing and Kambalu are the same place. So Kanbalik and Kambalu are the same place. That's what they're trying to say. So, with that in mind, Tamerlane is on his way to attack Beijing when he gets a revolt. He gets word that Calix has revolted and has taken Kambalu. So, isn't that Beijing? So surely he's just heard that Calix has taken Kambalu. So he then goes and he goes, right, we're not attacking Beijing anymore. We're going to go and attack Kambalu, which is Beijing apparently. So then he goes and attacks Kambalu, beats Calix at Kambalu, which is Beijing, and then he leaves Beijing going, good job, lads. Now, let's go attack Beijing. It doesn't make sense, does it? And then in the very next chapter, he mentions the wall 33 times because he's coming over the fucking wall. That's why he's mentioned it 33 times, because he's got to get over the wall. Pages dedicated to how they get round the wall. On page 60, it says, as he was nearest to the enemy, he had an opportunity to discover in what places the wall that stopped the Tartarian inroads might be assaulted. So on page 60, he's talking about what places on this wall he would be able to attack to get through. They found a local prince who took liking to them, and he betrayed the Chinese and divulged a secret passage that he knew that led into China, and it was easy to go in and surprise the soldiers that were guarding the wall. So again, why would he have to do this if he's already taken Kambalu? That doesn't make sense. None of that makes sense. So I've just spent quite a while on this because I need to hammer home that Kambalu and Beijing are not the same place, and this is obvious. This is obvious that they're not the same place. You'd have to be a moron to think they're the same place, because all the mentions of the wall are when he attacks Pekin. We saw him mention Pekin up here, Liutum and of Pekin. So why is he calling it Pekin if it's also Kambalu? Why is he confused? Why doesn't he realise that Calix is already at this place? Why doesn't he realise that he's had to cross a wall? Why is he worried about attacking the same wall if he's already crossed it so easily? He crossed it so easily, apparently he didn't even notice the first time. That doesn't make sense. So, Kambalu and Khan Balik are two very different places. Khan Balik is Beijing, yes, as in Khan Balik. Kambalu, that's a different place entirely. On page 108, all things having been thus ordered, the army took the way to Kambalu, but before they began to march, the prince sent to the emperor, his uncle, to inform him of his happy successes and return. So he's returning to Kambalu. The army in their return homewards carried with them all their sick people, and after 2 days' march they met with the new recruits that were coming to assist them. The prince ordered them to proceed on no further, but to return home towards Kambalu, whither he intended to go and meet with the emperor, who had intended to see him there and give him a triumphing reception. So the emperor, who is Tamerlane's uncle, is meeting him at Kambalu. So, and he's saying, return home towards Kambalu. Go back, go to Kambalu. Don't worry, we're leaving China. We're going home. We're going to go see the emperor in Kambalu. So again, how can Kambalu and Pekin be the same place? They're not. That's where history's lying. They've made a very big effort. I don't know who exactly, whether it was the Chinese, whether it was the Jesuits, the Russians, but they've made a very big effort to lie about the location of Kambalu, because it was definitely north of the Wall of China. Because if it was south of the Wall of China, then it wouldn't make sense. If Kambalu was south of the Wall of China, then Tamerlane never would have had to bother with getting over the wall. All of this stuff about the wall would be nonsense. It just wouldn't make sense. And there's many references to China being behind the wall to defend against the Tartarians. So why would Tartarians be behind the wall? None of that makes sense. So the document provided us some information, the 83rd to 180th degree longitude, 39 to 72 lat, and also 4,000, 2,000 miles going up and down. So we're going to have a look at that on Google Maps to plot that for you. So we get this box if we tap up the coordinates. As you can see here, this is, one of the coordinates there. The reason that's out in the ocean is because, obviously, north to south, they're trying to get every bit in. But they did a very good job when you consider 1690. They got this is the top one here. That will be the one in the ocean. This one here, down in the middle of the desert. And obviously it goes all the way up to the northern borders. So these are the coordinates that were given in that book. And this is the area that it says is Tartary. It says that it's on the east of Russia. So obviously Russia over here, but this is where it does get a little bit confusing because Russia was owning big chunks of this at this point, and they were moving in this way. And as well, by 1690, the Russians had conquered all the way up to here. So 1690, the Russians had actually conquered all of this. So Tartaria and its exact location around about the time of this document is very debatable, because in 1689 we had the Treaty of Nechinsk, which saw Russia take all the land up to this border here, which was the Amur River, and they got everything on this side, and the Tatars, the Qing dynasty, they were in here. So that gives us more evidence that Kambalu was probably somewhere around here in the Manchuria area, or possibly around here somewhere, but definitely around here. Now, if we take the 4,000 miles it gave from Astrakhan, because Astrakhan was part of the Tartarian area, so this is Tartaria Minor in Ukraine. This is the original Tartarian areas around Kazan, because this is actually where you'll find the Republic of Tatarstan, also known as Tataria, right there. He's trying to take us over to the one in Romania. Yeah, that's another thing with the Tartarian tablets. Look at that another day. But you've got the Republic of Tatarstan. This area was officially known as Tataria, without the R, the Tataria. So from Astrakhan all the way up to the borders of Cathay, which is here, and we'll discuss Cathay as well briefly. Cathay is another thing that's been twisted. So Cathay, they'll tell you, is North China, and the Manji is South China. So as Wikipedia will tell us, Cathay is a historical name for China that was used in Europe. During the early modern period, the term Cathay initially evolved as a term referring to what is now northern China, completely separate and distinct from China, which was a reference to southern China. So they try and say that it's North China and South China, but it's a little bit more than that. The Cathay region is the area beyond the Great Wall, so it's the area north of the Great Wall. Everywhere south of the Great Wall is the Manji. They're the Chinese. So, and well, there's a debate on Manji becoming Manchurians. So there is that. But Manji is the south of the wall, and Cathay is north. We'll have a look at some of the pictures, and you'll see. This one's interesting, by the way. I won't talk about it, but it's got Antichrist and Gog Magog here. It's flipped upside down, so this is north. But we'll have a look, for example, on... Well, this map is a 1570 map. It's not a great one. China's down here. Cathay is here. So it's a little bit... That will be more north, because obviously follow the curvature that is added on. So from China, that is actually north. Then you can see on this map, you've got a similar thing. This says Manji down here and the Cathay region up here. So we'll find one with a wall, because the wall is... Here we go. So that we can see up here, China is listed as China, and this is the Great Wall here following the mountains. And Cathay is north of the Great Wall. Now this is important because we have Peking down south of the Great Wall. So Peking is right here, and up here is actually where we have Kambalu. So it's quite hard to see, but that's Kambalu up there. Poor image. I could get a better one up. I probably should do. Go on, just for you. There we go. So got a better quality version, and you can see the Great Wall right here. So actually this one looks a little bit different. But yeah, so you've got the Great Wall right here. Peking would obviously be down here. And on the north of the Great Wall is where you'll find Kambalu and Kambalu River and stuff like that. I don't care. Thank you. Right, Kambalu would be there. It's definitely north of the Great Wall. And of course, that's how it describes it, because Tamerlane, he goes to Cathay where Kambalu is in Cathay, and then he has to go to China and he has to jump the wall. So evidently, Kambalu is north of the wall. Now, back to the document. It says it has remained unconquered under several governments until 1162. So we did read that. The imperial seat is at Shambalu. So yes, of course. Is this talking about Kambalik in Beijing, or is it talking about somewhere north of the wall in Cathay? That's for you to decide, but hopefully I've convinced you. The inhabitants are Mahometans, pagans, some Christians of the Nestorian sect, and it also talks about the language. So the language is the Tartarian language, very boisterous and clamorous, Almost the same with the Turkish, having some mixture of Persian and Scythian words. In some places they use the Persian tongue. Now that talks about their chief commodities, what they sell, and it also breaks up Tartaria into 5 great parts. Tartaria Deserta, which is the most western province bordering on Russia, and it's divided into the Kalmuki Butchers or the Olgarians, the Chazag or the Kashgars, and the Karakathays or the Shamshalites. And the 2 main cities, or the capital cities, are Sharkan and Kumberlik. So, or it does say the capital city of the whole, or the main city of the whole, is Sharkan or Karkan, however you want to say that. So you've got Karkan and Kumberlik. Notice how that is very similar to Kambalu. It's probably the same meaning. Kumberlik, Khanbalik, city of the Sham or city of the Khan. So it does seem that this name is something that moves around as well, because obviously if you've just set up a new kingdom and you build a new city, you say, this is my city, the city of me, city of the Sham. So Khanbalik, Khanbalik, Kambalu. So yeah, the second part is Uzbek or Zagathay on the south of Tartaria Deserta. It's about 1,200 miles long, and it contains the old provinces of Sakai, Sogdania, and parts of Scythia and Old Persia. So this is the bit that, as we know, was called Independent Tartary for a while, until the Russians finally invaded that. The capital cities are Samarkand, which is where Tamerlane is supposedly from, Bukhara, and Istygius, which I've never heard of that one. It's probably got a different name, which I have heard of. There's also the provinces of Belch, Alfoid, or Alsoid, Khwarazm, Al-Shah, and Targana. The third part of Tartaria is Turkestan, which is part of ancient Scythia, and it's on the east of Zagathay, about 1,400 miles long. The capital cities or capital towns are Tibet, Kaskar, and Khotan. It contains many kingdoms as Kaskar, Chialis or Turfan, Chiatium, Khotam, Tibet, Kamul, Lop, Tainsu, Kindu, and others. The Lop, of course, can be located today, the Lop Desert, so there would have been the Kingdom of Lop in the Lop Desert, so that does give you an idea that these are the right places. Turkestan on the east of independent Tartary. Tartaria Deserta, as it's known, is north of that. So it's very interesting that they call that the desert, considering I would argue that the Lop is the desert, but... Now, the fourth section is called Mongol or Magog, the true old Tartary. It's on the north of Turkestan, about 1,800 miles long and 950 in breadth. The chief towns are Mongol and Tenduk. It contains many provinces as Sumogul or Tartar, Tenduk or Mekrat, Baju or Mekrit, Tekmogul, Kali, and others. So Mongol or Magog is north of Turkestan, which does seem to match with Mongolia and areas to the east. And then finally, we have Cathay or Kin Tartary on the southeast of Mongol, about 1,650 miles long and 1,100 miles in breadth. It contains 4 great provinces: Cathay or Nayman, Kambalu or Arab Kambalik, Nish or Tenduk, and Yupi. It contains the ancient Serica and parts of Scythia. I'll bring us back to another map, because on Wikipedia they're obviously talking about how Cathay is China. It's exactly the same as China. But anyway, so you can kind of sense the passive aggressiveness with the Cathay is finally gone. This 1689 map by Giacomo Cantelli da Vignola from Modena identifies it and Manji with China. So now, if we zoom in on this, we can see Peking and Liaotung. So those are the places that were mentioned as where Tamerlane was about to go and invade, until he got word that Calix, one of the kings of Tartary, had decided to take over Kambalu. Now, Kambalu isn't shown on this map, but it's usually shown as being either near the Sungari or Kwentung Fluvius. So it's still in this region. So even though Cathay has gone, it's still here. It's not China. It's still south of the wall. I mean, it became China, as in they invaded China. So it's one of these things where it's a confusion, but they've also purposely tried to do it. Now, you'll notice over here is the UP that was just mentioned. the Tartary de Yupi. So we just heard about the Yupi people, and they're over here on the right. So this is the Chinese south of this wall. We can have a look at this picture. This picture from just before, which shows us Cathay up here, Kambalu right here on this river, which is called the River Pulisanja on this map. So we can see that Kambalu is right here, and it's outside the wall, a wall of 400 leagues betwixt the banks of hills, built by the kings of China against the breakings in of the Tartars. Kingdom of the Great Sham, and it's north of the walls. Cathay, it's north of the walls, it's northeast. So it's very easy to work out once you realise that. And you can see the mountains of the greatest note are those anciently called Imao, dividing Tartary in the middle. The rivers of principal note are 4. The Obi, which we know about the Obi because that's in Russia. Okanda, Chesil, or the Jaxartes, which is located in independent Tartary. And Polisanya, which is the one we just saw located northeast of China in Cathay. And there's the most considerable lakes are 4. We've got Kithay, Kithaska, Koras, and Amu. These are all very difficult to locate today. Some very interesting things have happened there. So, I hope you've enjoyed going through this document. Like I said, when I checked the other things, there are a load of documents that include the same kind of info or similar kind of info. So, it's just a tedious process to go through all of these and find all the things that you need to really build a picture. It's evident from what we've seen that obviously China here, this isn't Cathay. Maybe this was Manji. But this is Cathay. This is Cathay here. Over here are the Yupi people. This is where you find the Yupis, which makes sense with the map that we found. And if we have a look at Yupi Tartars, they're known as the Nanai people. And they lived along the Amur River, and they were actually evacuated by the Chinese originally. So the Amur River is, of course, this one that we saw over here. This makes this border. So this river here, it comes from up there, down there, around there. So these people are from here. And on this map that I got from Rare Maps, the date on this, it's from Stockholm, London, 1730. So the reason we come to this one, obviously we can see down here the Great Wall of China peeking there. And if we come up, we can see our Amur River. Now, it does have a different flow. It comes right from the side instead of coming from up. So that could just be a mapping issue there. Or maybe it did actually flow a bit differently a few hundred years ago. But we can see Yupi Tartaros down here. So that matches that map that we just saw, which is up here, Tartary de Yupi. So the Yupis are around this corner. Cathay is right here, just beyond this wall. So have a look at the wall. Cathay, the Yupis are going to be up here. So having a look at this here, again, we've got the Great Wall of China around here, the Yupis around here. So where do we think Cathay is going to be? Around here somewhere, isn't it? This will be the Cathay region. So we can assume that Kambalu, the proper Kambalu, not Kambalik, proper Kambalu was around here somewhere, with a Christian kingdom till for only 60 years, supposedly set up by Prester John, or maybe even Didymus Thomas himself. Although I think if it was Didymus Thomas, he'd be about 1,200 years late because he was supposed to be around at the same time as Jesus. But very interesting. I mean, it might have taken him 1,200 years to walk all the way from Jerusalem. It's a bit of a distance. So I think we'll call that one the end of that. I hope you've enjoyed watching and learning. I hope you learned a lot from that book. I hope you've learned about Cathay and Kambalu, and you can join us on the hunt for these places where they really were, because there is a lot of confusion. I mean, who knows, maybe these places really were south of the wall, but I think when you look at the books talking about how Kambalu is evidently a separate place, the book about Tamerlane has Calix, one of the kings, fighting. He goes and he tricks the people of Kambaluk to join him, and Tamerlane goes to fight him. And he fights him and he takes back Kambaluk, and then he says, right, I'm off to China. And he goes to invade China. So you can imagine he's coming down and he's saying, right, I'm going to go take out China, sort him out for you, uncle, because his uncle wanted him to. And then he gets a call and he says, hey, can you do me a favour? Can you go sort out Kambaluk? Because one of our kings has had a revolt. So Tamerlane sighs, he goes, go on then. Goes over to Kambaluk, sorts him out, gets Kambaluk back and says, right, problem solved. Now I'm going to China. And he crosses the wall, crosses the wall, takes over Liaotun and Peking, takes over those two places, and then he crosses back and he goes to Cambaluc where he finds his uncle waiting for him and he's really happy. It makes sense, doesn't it? That makes geographical sense. He goes to a place, then he goes to another place, and then he goes back to the place. It doesn't make sense if all three of those places are the same place. Or two of the places, you know? It doesn't make sense. So anyway, hope you guys learned a lot. We'll be back learning more about Tartaria, trying to figure out the truth behind this, because there is so much misinformation out there, so much they don't want you to know. It's probably why they focus on these global energy empire theories, because they don't want you to know the truth, that there was just actually a country that existed even a few hundred years ago that's been completely wiped out. The people have had their history changed and rewritten, and they just think that they're, you know, nomadic scrubs that have always lived in the middle of nowhere. When in reality, a few hundred years ago, they had one of the greatest empires in the world in about 14 to 1500. This empire covered everywhere from China to Egypt. So, you know, big swathes of Europe fell as well. So, you know, the Golden Horde's invasions into Europe. You're looking at an empire that went all the way from there down to here. There are notes that some of the Khans took over Egypt. Tamerlane supposedly did it. Another one supposedly did it. They took over these sections, the Indian Empire, the Mughals, which were actually remnants of Tamerlane's empire. They took all these sections. They beat the Muscovites back. They put Dmitry Donskoy in power up in Moscow. So they controlled the whole thing. Essentially, half the world was under Tartarian control. And when we say that, there was still loads of different kings, because, you know, you still need kings to run your country. You don't go in killing everyone. You go in, you take over the place, and you say, right, I've beat you in battle, now you pay me money every year. So that's essentially what was going on. It was just one giant empire, and they were always having revolts, you know. It wasn't peaceful. If you're over here fighting a battle, you can bet that a city over here was having a revolt. Maybe there was a king around here that decided to unify a few tribes and attack somewhere. Maybe they were feeling a bit oppressed. Maybe they didn't like their treatment. So it was just like any other empire. There was people all the time trying to usurp, trying to take over. Sometimes the empire fell to pieces and didn't really have a grand emperor collecting money from everyone. Sometimes battles would happen and everyone would go, I'm not paying anymore. And then the emperor can't do anything about it. So more places say, well, I'm not going to pay either. And then within 50 years, nobody's paying anything. And then they'll get a reunification where someone like Genghis Khan comes along and he says, right, I'm sorting this shit out. And he goes around and beats everyone and starts collecting money again. Rinse and repeat. So that's basically what's happened. And then they lost out to Russia. They lost out to Russia in the 15 to 16, 1700s. And eventually they were trapped in China and independent Tartary. And they were slowly beaten in the independent Tartary wars around here by Russia. And they were slowly beaten by the British, the French and the Russians in the Opium Wars. So this kingdom went from controlling everything in about 1500, 1530 maybe, controlling essentially everything, to being wiped out by about the 1900s. When it comes to Tartaria, this is definitely the most difficult place to find information about. If you look on YouTube or other blogs and forums, Stolen History, I think most people will probably focus on the idea of buildings in America being older than they seem. Settlements and cities growing to have huge populations much faster than they should have done. Some people even suggest that things like the railroads were actually dug out instead of built, you know, things like this. We're not going to be touching on any of that stuff. As you know, on this channel, we try to focus on what we can find in the historical data. We don't really try to touch too much on speculation or things that we can't find evidence for. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. Doesn't mean it did happen. It's just not what we do here.
We don't do that here.
We look for things that we can actually find evidence for, and then we talk about that. If you want to speculate on what might have happened as a result, or the consequences, then that's up to you. But we talk about what we can find. And this is something that, like I say, I have avoided for quite a while because the information out there is just so little, and I didn't want to provide something to you guys that was fantastical without being able to back any of it up. So, for example, on Stolen History, on their main article about Tartaria that was posted a good few years ago now, I think about 2020, One of my first videos was actually on this, but I ended up deleting it because at the time I really didn't have much knowledge on Tartaria, so I ended up deleting it because they do make a lot of mistakes in this, I must be honest. They do sometimes give you some good information, don't get me wrong, and definitely good sources and links. But yeah, anyway, so coming from Stolen History, this was their biggest article about Tartaria, and they made the claim in this map of 1652 that Tartary appears to have control over North America. And I'm not 100% sure on what the basis for that claim actually is. I've brought up the high quality of the map. I think the reason that they're suggesting that it's controlled by Tartary is because it's the same colour, which is kind of ridiculous, because as we see, Europe is one colour. South America is the same colour, so are they trying to suggest that Europe and South America are the same team? I'm not really sure. Africa is obviously one colour as well, so is the African continent a whole country? No. I think the whole reason that they're saying that it's part of Tartary is actually because it's coloured yellow and so is Tartary, although if you see the corner of Tartary here, it's green. If that is the reason, that's pretty stupid. I'm going to be honest, because, you know, these two are the same colour, and they're definitely not one giant country. Africa isn't one giant country. We do see over here that we have some text written about America. So looking around, a lot of named places, but there's nothing that indicates any cities down there or anything. Over here as well, I'm not going to translate the whole thing, but it basically just talks about Columbus discovering it and then other people doing it afterwards. But notice that the date is actually 100 years incorrect, because Columbus discovered America in 1492. Rather curious, isn't it? That they seem to make that mistake. Got it out by a whole 100 years. Going back to Stolen History, don't worry, by the way, I will be showing you some decent evidence that could suggest that these things are different. Just going through this first. And then the other thing that they mention on American Tartary is, they do say the jury is still out on this, but there are some indicators that Tartary was present in the North American continent as well. There obviously are no official historical accounts, but some bits and pieces of info suggest just that. You know, it goes against what they said before about that map seemingly showing the whole of North America being under Tartarian control, because it's just kind of ridiculous. But we're going to talk about the reality of it, because that's a bit of a nutcase claim, but we're going to talk about the reality. So the main things that they go off is this person that you may or may not have heard of called King Tartarax. And then there's also this map here, and it provides this source here from this book for the text. I wanted to see the map, because the map and the text are separate. He's just stuck the text over and he hasn't provided a source of the map. So what we'll do is we'll have a look at that text itself. And this book is by Uzziah Priest from 1834. It's called American Antiquities and Discoveries in the West, so you can check that out for yourself. And they've got a whole chapter here, the voyages and shipping of the Mongol Tartars and settlements on the western coast of America. But what we're actually going to do is we're going to come back to this book shortly, because there's something else that connects with it that I want to bring up first, because this goes into detail on that. So first we're going to have a look at a map. And whilst it's not quite the same, we can see with this one that we're trying to find, that's got pink on this side, the green here and the yellow down here, and Hispania Nova. It's a similar thing. Hispania Nova here, you can see this area here. So maybe it's trying to suggest that this area is its own region. I think they're trying to suggest that this is Tartaria, and then obviously the Spanish come down here and the Europeans have come over from this side. So I think that's what they're trying to suggest, is that this is Tartarian. This map as well has a very similar thing going on about it. Once again, 1492, so they've got it correct on this map. But you can see that they've got this place called Quivera, which is connected to Tartarax, which we're going to talk about shortly. But yeah, it is, again, similar thing. Hispania Nova, this side here where we think the Europeans have come in, and then this, which is what they're suggesting, is the Tartarian sections. So it definitely wasn't control over the whole North American region. I think, if anything, it will have been the West Coast. It is actually important to remember that the main migrations of Native Americans are actually from Asia. The thing is, though, the official history will tell you, looking at this haplogroup map here, that they came over 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago. I think the most recent ones they'll say is about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. But anything after that, they say it didn't happen, which is curious. Why were people able to cross these oceans 5,000 years ago, but they weren't able to do it 1,000 years ago? The original idea behind it is the frozen land bridge theory, that they were able to cross over the Bering Strait and then move south from there. Then you've also got them sailing around these islands up to Kamchatka and then going across that way. But that also can fit in with the land bridge theory, because of the lower water levels are 150 meters lower at one point. But then we have this one down here, which is evidently a water crossing, and they admit that 5,000 years ago people did cross over to America on boats. So King Tartarax essentially comes from this story to do with our Spanish adventurers that were looking for gold. This man here, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, and essentially what it was having a look for the 7 cities of Cibola, the 7 cities here. And the 7 cities corresponded to El Dorado, Paititi, City of the Caesars, Lake Parima at Manoa, Antilia, and Quivira. Today it's located around the Arkansas River in central Kansas, that's what they say anyway, and it was not a city of gold, and it was just a community of Wichita people. That's the official thing. So where do the stories come from? Well, from one of the historians, one of the expeditions, it says, in the year 1530, Nuno de Guzman, who was president of New Spain, had in his possession an Indian, one of the natives of the valley of Oaxaca, who was called Tejo by the Spaniards. This Indian said he was the son of a trader who was dead, but that when he was a little boy, his father had gone into the back country with fine feathers to trade for ornaments, and that when he came back, he brought a large amount of gold and silver, of which there is a good deal in that country. He went with him once or twice, and saw some very large villages, which he compared to Mexico and its environment. He had seen 7 very large towns which had their streets of silver workers. And there were also reports given by 4 shipwrecked survivors of the failed Narvaez expedition, which included this fellow here, another Spanish explorer, as well as a Moorish slave named Esteban Dorantes. And when they returned to New Spain, the adventurers said that they had heard stories from the natives about cities with great and limitless riches. So when we talk about the lost cities of gold, this is definitely connected. And of course, the official history is that when Coronado and his other adventurers arrived at Cibola in 1540, they couldn't find any gold, and it turned out all the stories had been made up. See, from this map here of the Coronado expedition, we can see where he supposedly went and where he found out that it was all nonsense. The forum also provides a load of other pictures that show Quivira in its different locations that we're just going to have a quick peek at. This one here showing it on this corner. Here again, it reminds us that 1492 Christopher Columbus discovered America. Some of these are pretty bad quality, but again, it's over on this left-hand side. You can see they did believe it to be somewhere called the Anian Strait, so that's what they called the Bering Strait before, and they believed it was a lot more south than it actually is. But interestingly, which kind of goes against this this whole notion, if you read this here, it says the indigenous of this region, after the manner of the Tartars, live in tents, having no cities. One more showing Quivira on the left, 1492 again, so it is quite interesting that that one thought it was 1592. I should probably let it go, but another one here, and again, this one says a similar thing in the corner. Here the people in groups through the plains, in company in that way, in tents, after the manner of the Tartars, and they lead a rustic life. So, pretty poor English there, but basically the people here, they live in groups, and just like the Tartars, they live in tents and lead a nomadic lifestyle, is what they're trying to suggest. And this one again, this one making it appear much more like Alaska or something, in my opinion. Looking, circle of Antarctica up here, looking way further north, because people hypothesized that it was down near California, possibly. And then, of course, looking inland, but Quivira definitely looking like it's on the coast. So that journey that they took, the expedition inland, no wonder they didn't find it, because I would say this looks more like Northwest America, getting much further up towards Alaska, which would make sense because of the migratory route that they would have taken over the Bering Strait. And another final picture. So yeah, you can see up here, we've got China, Cathay, the Mongol areas, missing quite a bit of Siberia. And that's because they just couldn't get up there. Don't forget, the Russians didn't make it to the edge of Kamchatka till about 1690. It was only after 1690 that you're ever going to see a map showing Kamchatka properly. By the official history, anyway. Up to you if you want to believe that. We can see this text talking about Quivira, saying the many different lost cities like Atlantis, lost continent of Mu, Kublai Khan, Xanadu, and it's basically saying the 7 cities of Cibola and Quivira, they fall into the same category. It says it's a city born in the mind of Coronado's conquistadors through their greed for gold. The kingdoms of Quivira and Anian are located on maps of Western America, but they had no more existence in reality than Thor's Valhalla or the abode of the Olympian gods. That is the official line for Quivira, that these guys didn't exist. And before we move off of King Tartarax into the actual Mongol Tartar movements into America, we do have some decent stuff to look at, by the way, so make sure you do stick around. we're just going to have a look at this book, this Garden of the Gods, because I did find a mention of King Tartarax in here, which was quite cool. And it's just down here, Amateur Rodeo, 1910s, and it says, the 1910s brought an economic slump to the Colorado Springs. To offset this slump, some residents sought to draw tourist trade by staging a historical pageant about Indians and the 16th century activities of the conquistadors in New Mexico and of old King Tartarax of Quivira. So, King Tartarax of Quivira, obviously people point to the fact that Tartar-Rax is like Tartar Rex, aka King of the Tartars. Tartar itself obviously sounds like Tartars. So that would be, King Tartar King. Obviously trying to suggest that it's a mistranslation and it's essentially just the Latin for King Tartar of Quivira. And the final King Tartarax is just an article from 1889. It talks all about Coronado going to find Cibola with his team, trying to go to the legendary City of Gold. And we can see mentions of King Tartarax, that this realm of Quivira was ruled by the mighty monarch Tartarax, who lived in magnificent splendor, that gold was so common among these people as to be of little value, that they made utensils and farming implements, and that the monarch Tartarax and his subjects lived in splendor. Their warriors wore helmets and bore shields of gold. So yeah, this is apparently all in their heads. Somebody made this up and then they went looking for it, and it does mention Tartarax quite a bit. Just talking about the story, this is stuff that you can come and read for yourself if you want, because we don't need to go into it. It will just be talking about how they never found him. It is interesting that Tartarax was clearly a bigger part of the mythology in the 1800s, because most people won't hear about it now. And they're just talking about holding an event to basically stage the whole thing. King Tartarax, the Spanish, etc., etc. And it's what we saw in that last book that they were talking about, but a bit better than a rodeo. So just like the event in the 1910s that we saw in that book, The Garden of the Gods, they're talking about holding a similar event, and this guy's suggesting who they should have and play characters and stuff. So it was, like I say, if they're doing it in the 1910s and there's something in the 1890s, it was clearly part of the local mythology up until that point, which would be quite sad if it's been erased from the local memory. That's just, I think that's our last mention of Tartarax, or there was one more book actually. The last one just brings up Tartarax again in the secret cities of South America, and it's talking about... It is also added as a memory of a great cataclysm that when Quetzalcoatl vanished, the sun and moon were covered in darkness and only a single star remained in the sky. Humboldt, in his Examen, says that the Franciscan monk Mark de Niza crossed the 37th parallel, a line linking California with Virginia, seeking a bearded King Tartarax who adored a golden cross and the image of a woman called the Lady of Heaven, which usually would suggest Mary. So this next book that we're going to come to is The Great Events in the History of North and South America from the alleged discovery of the continent by the Northmen in the 10th century to the present time. Now, of course, that's referring to Leif Erikson and the Northmen, the Viking-type people who came over in the 10th century rather than Christopher Columbus, and that is in 1851. So it is quite interesting that people were quite aware of Leif Erikson, yet we still have Columbus Day. Why not Erikson Day? Why we came to this book is just for one little mention down here. The book obviously is talking about the ways in which America could have been populated, and it says, Dr. Swinton, author of many parts of the universal history, after stating the different opinions of various authors who have advocated in favor of the dispersed people, the Phoenicians and other eastern nations, observes that therefore the Americans in general were descended from a people who inhabited a country not so far distant from them as Egypt and Phoenicia. One will, as we apprehended, readily admit. Now, no country can be pitched upon so proper and convenient for this purpose as the northeastern part of Asia, particularly Great Tartary, Siberia, and more especially the peninsula of Kamchatka. That probably was the tract through which many Tartarian colonies passed into America and peopled the most considerable part of the New World. So, of course, he's saying that right here, the Tartarian colonies, very interesting, Tartarian colonies passed into America. So 1851, they're trying to suggest that. And, of course, it was actually a widely accepted thing that the Indians were Tartars, which isn't as much of a generalized statement as you might think, because we actually classify humans into three types, essentially white, black, and brown. And the Mongoloid, is that race classification. Anybody from Asia is essentially classified as that. So the North Americans do fall under that category and that classification. Our next source is from the historical collections of the Indians in New England, and it's provided, I think, for the king at the time, Charles II, around the 1600s. We will see. So it'll be from Charles's collection. And this interesting bit down here. Secondly, another apprehension is that the original of these Americans is from the Tartars or Scythians that live in the northeast parts of Asia, which some good geographers conceive is nearly joined unto the northwest parts of America, and possibly a one continent, or at least separated by some narrow gulf. And they were correct, of course, with the Bering Strait. And the Bering Strait is so small. It's smaller than some crossings of the English Channel, some sections, and you can stop. You've got a pair of islands right in the middle that you can stop on and then make the next leap of the journey. You could do it in a canoe very easily. But it goes on to just talk about how they are very like the Scythian people in colour, shape and manners. But it does actually say about sheep, horses and camels and other tame beasts that are not found in America among the Indians. So that literally is the question they pose there. They say, if this people be sprung from the Tartarian or Scythian people, as this nation asserts, so these people do seem to assert, I think the Indians themselves must have asserted it, then it is to me a question why they did not attend the known practice of that people, who, in all of their removes and plantations, take with them their kine, sheep, horses, and camels, and the like tame beasts. And of these sorts and kinds of beasts used by the Tartars, none were found in America among the Indians. This is it's a different version of the same document we saw earlier that just essentially says the same thing. Probably was the tract with which many of the Tartarian colonies passed into America, aka, through Kamchatka, from Great Tartary, Siberia. This is not to be denied. It's the most rational way of getting inhabitants into America, if it must be allowed that it was peopled from the Old World. So they're saying if the America was peopled from our world, because America's the new world, the old world, then they must have come through there because it's the shortest distance, and that just makes sense. Another one going from about 1820, so yeah, it's the American Indian Origin Theories as of 1820 by Samuel Mitchell. We'll see the paper covers new ground in showing that Professor Samuel Mitchell, formerly of Columbia College, had concluded that two main groups of people once dominated the Americas, the Tartars of Northern Asia and the Australasians of the Polynesian Islands. Furthermore, they fought one another for many years, culminating in great battles of extermination in what later became upstate New York. This New York theory has much in common with the Book of Mormon. The book then carries on to talk about a rumor of a Portuguese Jew that went around, and of Antonio Montesinos, who claimed that he had been led of God to discover a holy people, a tribe of ancient Jews, in the mountains of Nueva Granada in 1641, basing his claim on similarities of sacramental rites, customs, and languages between this group and those of ancient Jews. Many people of the day turned to the respected Rabbi Manasseh to confirm or reject him. Sensing this opportunity to advance the cause of his people, Manasseh ben Israel published in 1650 his famous Hope of Israel, in which he strongly argued in favor of the lost tribes in America, claiming that they had mingled with Tartaric or Asian tribes in ancient Scythia before coming to America. Presenting remarkably little hard or new evidence, he nevertheless capitalized upon the renewed controversy to show that God's ancient people, the Jews, had indeed been scattered and dispersed to the four quarters of the earth. Another man known as Antonio de la Calancha, writing in the early 17th century, also posited that the Indians had descended from the Tartars of Eastern Asia. Likewise, the great English observer Edward Brerewood advanced the Acoustan tradition, arguing for a Tartarian origination via Alaska, since most Indians frequented the west coasts of the Americas. Other men during the same period, such as David Zeisberger, John Heckelwelder, Caspar Wistar, Pierre de Ponco, and Benjamin Smith Barton, all argued for the Tartaric origin of the Indians, for the Bering Strait theory, and for a common original language. In 1795, Professor Samuel Mitchell of Columbia College returned to his lifelong interest in the origins of the Indians, and he began to formulate his threefold interpretation of American Indian origins and history. Number one, that the three races of Malays, Tartars, and Scandinavians contributed to make up the American population. That the Tartars eventually overwhelmed and destroyed the other two races over a fairly long period of time. And finally, that the final battles of extermination were fought in upstate western New York, not too far from the south of Lake Ontario. Mitchell began teaching college classes in 1816, saying that both North and South America had been formerly populated fundamentally by two great races, not only the Hyperborean or inhabitants of the north, but also the Australasian or inhabitants of the south, the former Tartars, and the latter Malays and Polynesians. So it's interesting to note that he is equating the northern people, the Tartars, with the Hyperboreans. His reason for claiming the North American Indians' ancestors were the Tartars were based on four factors: the similarity of their physical features, the affinity of their languages, the corresponding customs, and the kindred nature of American Indian dogs to those found in Siberia. Mitchell claims that all was going well with the Polynesian derivative of peoples until their confrontation with the encroaching Tartars. Colliding with both the Europeans and the more delicate race of Australasians, the Tartars overwhelmed and destroyed both peoples in a long series of terrible conflicts centered primarily in upstate New York. As China, Hindustan, Palestine, Greece, Italy, and the shores of Africa have been conquered by the swarms, which preceded numberless times, so have Canada, the regions bordering on the Missouri, the lakes, the Mississippi, the Ohio, and the countries where New Spain and its intendancies now are, quite to Mexico, been subdued by hordes of savage adventurers from beyond the Arctic Circle. He went on to ask, what has become of these Australasians? And answered, they have probably been overcome by the more warlike and ferocious hordes that entered our hemisphere from the northeast of Asia. These Tartars of the higher latitudes have issued from the great hive of nations and desolated, in the course of their migrations, the southern tribes of America, as they have done to those of Asia and Europe. The greater part of the present American natives are the Tartar stock, the descendants of the hardy warriors who destroyed the weaker Malays that preceded them. Mitchell's work was accepted by Uzziah Priest, whose work we've actually seen in this video, The American Antiquities and Discoveries in the West, which was published in Albany, New York in 1833. Although providing for the inclusion of vestiges of the lost tribes in parts of ancient America via an ancient land bridge with Africa, Priest believes the Tartars, in Hun-like fashion, completely destroyed the more southerly people, who left behind some 3,000 burial mounds and fortifications in present-day Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The skeletons found in our mounds never belonged to a people like our Indians, he asserted. Their foreheads were low, cheekbones rather high. We think we ascertain the inhabitants to have been white, like the Europeans. Calling the more civilized people the Aries, he believed they were so exterminated by the Tartars or Scythians that but one member of the nation, a warrior, remained. That's quite interesting that they believe them to be white. The Welsh supposedly migrated as well to the New World in about 560 AD, supposedly, under Prince Madoc. So that would be quite interesting. And they moved to the Ohio regions, and there's lots of evidence of the Welsh there. So that is quite curious. Maybe the Tartars were the ones that killed the Welsh in America. King Arthur himself was said to have sailed to the New World, where he was then killed by an Indian, by a native. And if that's a Tartar, that's a bit of a spin on the story. But we won't go into that today. So the next mention of American Tartary is actually rather curious. It's talking about America. It's a British letter. It's a letter going back to Britain. It's talking about the colonies. And they're talking about the cause of resistance. And it says the other cause of resistance is the prodigious expansion of the back settlements. Many of the people in the back settlements are already little attached to particular situations. They've already topped the Appalachian Mountains. From thence they behold before them an immense plain, one vast, rich, level meadow, a square of 500 miles. Over this they would wander, without a possibility of restraint. And surely, sir, it is impossible for us to restrain them. Undoubtedly, they will wander wherever they choose to do. They would soon change their manners with the habits of their life. They would soon forget a government by which they were disowned. They would become hordes of English Tartars, and pouring down upon your unfortified frontiers a fierce and irresistible cavalry, become masters of your governors and councillors, your collectors and controllers, and of all the slaves that adhered to them. So it's suggesting that the people that weren't living inside the colonies, the ones that had started moving west, they would become like the Tartars, and that they would destroy the colonies. And the response we get back is obviously, thanks, sir, thank you for these kind prophetic declarations. And down here it says, for indeed, whether the colony was placed in Asiatic or in American Tartary, the folly and absurdity of pretending to govern such a colony, and to make it subservient to the purposes of British commerce, would be just the same. Nature opposes it, as you justly observe, and nature will be obeyed. So they're saying, look, whether we put a colony in Asiatic or in American Tartary, it'll be the same. It would be absurd because nature is against it. They're too far away and they'll destroy us. So it's very curious that they're calling American Tartary. That's the bit, is why are they calling it American Tartary? This is one of the only, if not the only mention properly of American Tartary that we can actually find. There's only a couple. If you'd like to find that book, by the way, there's actually a better version that you have to borrow, unfortunately, but you can borrow it for an hour, but you can find it on Internet Archive. Josiah took a selection from his economic and political writings, and you can find that section right there. That's up there. So if you want to find that for yourself, you can do. You can also come to this called The Ancient Chinese Account of the Grand Canyon or the Course of the Colorado. It's a 44-page book, so we will definitely not be reading it. But essentially, it goes into how the ancient Mexicans likened North America to a tree, a stupendous mulberry tree planted in the land known to us today as South America. The Chinese geographers or mythologists teach at a distance of 10,000 miles to the east, there is a land over 3,000 miles in width. Now, the land referred to as must be North America, and we know that North America reaches 3,000 miles in width from the Pacific to the Atlantic. And the Chinese accounts further call our eastern realm a Fusang, or mulberry. A mulberry land is there, say the Chinese. The mulberry land is here, say the Mexicans. Like the Mexicans, the Chinese sages declare that there is an enormous tree, the Fu, or helpful Sang tree, in the eastern mulberry land, 3,000 miles wide. As just remarked, the Chinese call their enormous tree a Sang, and the Mexicans call their tree a Beb, both terms standing for the mulberry. Observe in Figure 2, which is over here. At Tehantepec, a little west of Yucatan, our continent narrows down to a width of 100 miles. The Mexicans say that North America is a tree and that it has correspondingly an enormous trunk, which at Tehantepec measures 100 miles. Now, the Chinese writers declare that the enormous mulberry in the region east of the Flowery Kingdom has a trunk of 300 li, or 100 miles. A mulberry tree with a trunk of 300 li is there, say the Chinese. A mulberry tree with a trunk of 300 li is here, say the Mexicans. So you can already see the connections between the Fusang and the Chinese, and if you want to read this book for yourself, you can do. We might go into this for a video for itself because it is very interesting, but I just wanted to bring this up, this connection here. The Chinese clearly knew about America. Once again, if you'd like to read this, here it is. You can find it on archive.org. Very easy. It was published in 1913. Ancient Chinese Account of the Grand Canyon. So if you want to read that, go ahead and do so. Now, talking of Josiah Priest that we did before, we can see his what he says down here. As it respects some of the ancient nations who may have found their way hither, as into America, we perceive a strong probability that not only Asiatic nations, very soon after the flood, of course the biblical flood is what they believe in, but also all along the different eras of time, different races of men, Polynesians, Malays, Australasians, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Israelites, Tartars, Scandinavians, Danes, Norwegians, Welsh, and Scottish have colonized different parts of the continent. And Josiah Priest also believed that before the flood, America was actually the country of Noah. It was where the ark was erected, and it was possibly where giants were in the biblical references. This book, another source on, so it's just talking about Tartarax. In early 1541, Coronado set out to find it, told of new and even more dazzling stories of Quivira. To the northeast, there was a river 7 miles wide. Within its depths were huge fish as large as horses. Tartarax the ruler slept in a garden of roses under a tree with thousands of golden bells, and even the pots and pans were made of gold. So it's stuff. I think they're just trying to make it sound ridiculous, to be honest. But that's that. Again, if you want to find that, you can do. So this guy was traversing America, and when he got to this bit, so we'll read from here. This forest ends just before you reach the Wabash, and from thence to the Mississippi, a distance of 80 miles, all is prairie or meadow. Here commences the American Tartary, bearing in all respects a strong resemblance to the Asiatic. He describes it, and below says, in all these features we recognize a likeness to the ancient Tartary, which would be entire and complete could we see its natives metamorphosed into horsemen. Obviously, because the Indians were supposedly not the same level of horsemen as ancient Tartary. The reason that this is conflicting is because there are different documents printed of this same text. And in some of the texts, this word here, this one, has been replaced with an. So it says, here commences an American Tartary. So this is where the confusion will come in, because they'll say, oh no, he was saying it's an American Tartary, because it looks like Tartary. To him, he got there and he's like, wow, this to me just looks like Tartary. However, some texts will say the American Tartary, which, again, is it referring to the American Tartary, or is it the American Tartary that guy referred to? And that's all up for debate. So it's up to you to decide. I've not been able to decide for myself. It could be either way. I'm not sure which ones have come first, because obviously all the books are reprints. It's very confusing which one that is. Right, as far as text go, this is actually the most interesting because it's just so left field. It's got some information that just doesn't really make sense, doesn't jive with what we know as history, and it's just kind of confusing. I'm not sure exactly why it's written this way, and I'll show you. So this is the book. If you want to find it, give it a pause and search for that. Or the easiest way to find it actually would just to be type in Hakata Tartary or something on Google. But if you really struggle, ask me and I'll post a link. So for reference, who Hakata is, by the way, Ogedai Khan. So once again, this book is talking about America. It mentions how all the areas of Tartary are on the same latitudes as America and it'd be easy to cross over. And of course it says, here too may be added that Asia hath no territory anywhere which may more easily with numerous colonies supply America than this part of Tartary, as well for the vastness of the country, to which no other can compare. As for the increasing of the inhabitants, who do not admire that according to Michaelan Lithauer, there is scarce a city in Tartary that boasted less than 1,000 temples. So, wow, according to this Michaelan bloke, there aren't many cities in Tartary that have less than 1,000 temples. And to see Kanguista, which is Genghis Khan, first king of Tartary, Genghis, first king of Tartary, about the year 1200, in arms, and his successor Hakata, following his father's bloody footsteps, whilst he prepared his sons with 3 vast armies. The eldest son, Jatchi, marched westward with 30,000 horse. Batu, drew with as great an army towards the north, and Toglade, being the youngest, fell into the Moors country above Egypt. Now this is where it gets really weird. Hakata himself marched victoriously into the North America, subdued great parts of the Persian kingdom, and beat the Turks, led by the general Goniata with a great army. In 1241. It's saying that Hakata marched into North America. I've been able to find no other references whatsoever for this, but it's saying he marched into North America. He's saying he subdued the greatest parts of the Persian kingdom and beat the Turks. I don't think it's necessarily saying that those took place in North America, even though it could seem that way. You know, just by the process of the chronological layout, you'd think that he's gone into North America, then he's subdued the Persian kingdom, and then he's beat the Turks. I don't think it's saying that. I think it's saying that he did those 3 things separately. However, what a very strange thing to say that he went into North America. It carries on as Jacob Placensis and Benedictus Sarmats, 2 monks sent by the Pope Innocent to Hakata, witness. The great number of the Tartars or Scythians may appear by the several people spread far and near over Tartary. It mentions a load of them that I'm not going to bother listing, but it mentions a lot of the tribes like the Hyperborean, the Khmeri, the Georgi, the Sakuras, and it says what number would the inhabitants make up, that live in America. And again, it mentions some places like Virginia, Florida, New Spain, Guatemala, and it's saying what many of these would live there. It would be worth our time to compare the likeness between the Scythians and the Northern Americans. And yeah, it just goes on to talk about how they are very similar. But the most interesting thing, of course, being Hakata. Hakata marched into North America around 1241, according to this document. Once again, for reference, I came to this book just to make sure that, it talks about Hakata here. So it talks about Changas, and then chosen by his subjects, he caused Hakata, his eldest son, to be crowned king. So there's Hakata, and down here we can see Hakata, i.e. Ogedai or Oktai. So we know who that is. Now, onto this book, which has some interesting information up here. We can see, in 1380, one of the naval squadrons of the great Tartar conqueror Kublai Khan, which sailed to invade Japan, was wrecked on the western coast of South America. The shipwrecked mariners thereupon, through some unspecified turn of the wheel of fortune, founded the Empire of Peru. And we'll return to this document, which is the one we talked about before, the Uzziah Priest one with the Mongols and their appearing, because this one is, it mentions a little bit more in detail about that landing on Peru, just a little bit, and Uzziah Priest is the one that we heard about, who based all his work on Mitchell, but it does have this information. So it says, a cross made of fine marble, beautifully polished, about 3 feet high and 3 fingers in width and thickness, was found in an Indian temple. This, it appears, was kept as sacred in a palace of one of the Incas, and was held in great veneration by the natives of South America. When the Spaniards conquered that country, they enriched this cross with gold jewels and placed it in the Cathedral of Cusco. But how came this emblem of Christianity in America? There were in the service of the Mongols in the 13th century many Nestorians, a sect of Christians, which we've heard about before. In the kingdom of Prester John was supposedly a Nestorian kingdom founded in the northeast, and Genghis Khan had a war with Uncham, who controlled it, and obviously won, and then in some stories even married his daughter. The conqueror of the king of Eastern Bengal was a Christian, which was in 1272. Under this king, a part of an expedition was sent to conquer the islands of Japan. In large Chinese vessels, and supposed to have been commanded by these Christian Nestorians as officers, being more trustworthy and more expert in warlike maneuvers than the Mongol natives. This expedition by some means found their way from the Japan Islands, which are west from North America, to the coast of America in the same latitude, and landed at a place called in the Mexican language Culcan, opposite New California, and obviously Kulkan, you can see where that might come from. And then it says in 1273, Kublai, as in Kublai Khan, a Mongol emperor, it appears, became master of all China. At that time they were in the possession of the knowledge of shipbuilding, so that vessels of enormous size were constructed by them. They were solidly and conveniently made as to carry elephants on the decks. The Peruvians had a tradition that many ages before their conquest by the Spaniards, there landed on their coast at St. Helens Point vessels manned with giants, having no beard, and were taller from their knees downward than a man's head, and they had long hair, which hung loose upon their shoulders, and that their eyes were wide apart and very big in other parts of their bodies. This description is supposed to be a description of the elephants and the riders blended into one animal. As they did in later years when the Spaniards rode on horses, they took them at first to be one animal. There remains not a doubt that the Mongol Tartars found their way from China to the west of America in shipping. The voyage is not so great as to render it impossible, as that a French vessel in the year 1721 sailed from China and arrived at a place called Val de Nandras on the coast in 50 days. The Phoenician letters were known among the Mongol nations. If therefore they found their way to South America, we at once account for the Phoenician characters found in caverns and cut into rocks of that country. A description of what is supposed a Chinese Mongol town to the west, called by themselves when first visited by the Spaniards Talameco, is exceedingly curious and situated on the bank of a river running into the Pacific from the territory now called Oregon, only 4 degrees south of Lake Erie and in longitude 87 or exactly west of Ohio in latitude. It was well built and contained 500 houses, some of which are large and show well at distance. So we'll leave that document there because there's so much to go through, and we'll probably cover it in another video if we remember to. But that is just collating all the evidence that, you know, it seems like Mongols and the Chinese definitely went into southern America and into Mexico and North America. That's definitely what it's looking like. This next document that I want to have a look at actually comes from a Pulp Fiction magazine, released in 1947, I believe. Yeah, 1947. So just once again, this is a Pulp Fiction magazine. It's still very interesting, but it's Pulp Fiction. Because this kind of text out of context, you could really use it for your own advantage. You could really help paint a false narrative with it. But it is Pulp Fiction. But the reason it's interesting is because what it says. In this person's story, which was printed in the magazine in 1947, they start talking about entering a room, and the character has entered this room, large room with a window overlooking the sea, and he sees a map on one of the walls, but such a map that they'd never seen. So it's a very large map, and it was a map of the world, but a world which was a combination of the ancient and the modern. And it says Macedonia and Greece rubbed elbows, one as large as the other. The United States was called American Tartary. Russia was the land of the Khan of Greater Russia. Siberia of Lesser Russia. Germany was called Teutonia. China bore its ancient name Cathay, and Japan was part of it. So I found that very curious that a fiction writer has come up with this. So they must have had some kind of information, unless they just it was pure chance. But I just found that really curious that they put that in. So 1947. Can you imagine that map? American Tartary, Russia with the land of the Khan of Greater Russia, and Lesser Russia with Siberia. So the Khan of Siberia, which that was a real thing, the Khanate of Siber. It fell in about 1584. So just to show you what I was talking about before when we looked at the document that said about, here commences the American Tartary, bearing in all respects a strong resemblance to the Asiatic, if you remember that. Well, to show you what I meant, we come to this document, which was released at a similar time. This one is 1807, and this one in fact says it's essentially the same thing. From the Wabash to the Mississippi, a space of 80 miles, there are nothing but savannas, and in reality here commences an American Tartary. An American Tartary. So you can see how if it's an instead of the American Tartary, then that can really change the context of what you're trying to say. So that's important that we remember that, because that simple word change can mean a big difference in what they're trying to suggest. Back to Uzziah Priest's book, and we can see this interesting thing here. It says, "From all we can make out by observing the growth of timber with that which is decayed, as found on the deserted works of the West, we are inclined to believe that about the same period of time when Europe was overrun by the northern hordes, that the region now called the United States, where the ancient inhabitants had fixed their abode, was also overrun by northern hordes from towards Bering Strait, who had in ages before got across from Asia, the Tartars or Scythians, and had multiplied, and as they multiplied, progressed farther and farther southerly, till they discovered an inhabited country, populous and rich, upon whom they fell with all the fury of Attila and the Huns." So we can only assume that that's suggesting when the northern hordes, as in the golden hordes, were falling upon Europe around the 12 to 1300s, that the hordes that were placed in the Alaskan regions that had crossed into the northern parts of Canada and moved south, they actually started moving south now, and they fell upon the inhabitants of America. That's actually seems to be suggesting this is a recent thing. This is why it's debatable. Europe has been overrun a couple times by hordes, so you could suggest that it's actually talking about the hordes of Attila the Hun, as it mentioned here, in which case that would put it at about 400, 500 AD. However, it could be talking about the Mongol hordes, which did overrun parts of Europe, although it didn't overrun all of Europe, so possibly that's it. As the Tartars have overrun China, so the Aztecs subdued Mexico. As the Huns and Alans desolated Italy, so the Chippewas and the Iroquois prostrated the populous settlements on both banks of the Ohio. The surviving race in these terrible conflicts between the different nations of the ancient native residents of North America is evidently that of the Tartars. This article coming from the New York Weekly Museum from 1817, we can see up here, it says, "Domestic manufactures, the pieces of goods prepared by the American Tartars and presented to Dr. Mitchell by Captain Richard Whitley, late of the US Army, are full of instruction." So American Tartars, quite interesting. It goes on to talk about Tartars and some other references to them. Like over here, it brings up what we talked about before with Dr. Mitchell and his points about the Tartars. So that just shows in 1817, it's in this newspaper, talks about the more cultivated Malays who peopled from southern parts of North America, form the famous records discovered in New Spain. The ruder Tartars who migrated to the northern regions of the same continent are the authors of the fabrics, not less curious, but in a totally different style, now under consideration. It also talks about how the Indian wigwams, after the manner of the Tartars, are circular and not square. We can see from this book here the journey through Russia and Siberia from 1787 to 1788, but it was republished in 1966. It calls them American Tartars. They have been a long time Tartars, and it will be a long time before they are any other kind of people. The yurt, or hut as we generally call it, or as the American Tartars call it, the wigwam, is in this country a substitute for a tent. So a yurt, of course, was the tent specifically used by the Mongols. In fact, the city of Tenduk, we saw Tenduk on a map before, that's actually named after the Tenduk that's found in the center of a yurt, the skylight essentially in the middle where you can pray through, because you'd pray to your god Tengri there, and that's called a Tenduk. I have a video about that if you want to learn more. The Asiatic, like the American Tartars, never change their dress. They are all the same on all occasions, in the field, in the house, on a visit, at the most dirty work, on a holy day. It is all the same, and they have never but one dress. It is very remarkable that both the Asiatic and American Tartars have the same caste or superstitious notions of women during their menstrual illness that Laban had in omitting to search for his silver gods when hid under Rachel, who feigned the menstruals. Very curious indeed. If we come to this book here, and once again, if you guys want to see any of the books, the reason I show you is so you can pause the video and then type this in and you'll go and find it. We can see at the bottom here, it says, if the tradition that men clothed in silk were seen at Quivira be well-founded, Hindus or Chinese or Japanese have mixed with the American Tartars. The Mexican and Peruvian kings, their almanacs and palanquins have come from Asia, as certainly as the Japanese in a later age have peopled the Kuril Islands, and the Moguls of a very remote age, Kamchatka. A different document here that we're looking at, Voyages of the South, Pairs, Parallels and Patterns in American Art and Literature. Once again, Henry Nasmith long ago reminded us that a writer in the portfolio, I like that, portfolio, in 1817 referred to the Northern Plains Indians as the American Tartars, whilst Timothy Flint spoke of the Southwest Indians as ruthless red Tartars of the desert. This book coming from 1851, The Bible and Civil Government in Course of Lectures. We can see it says here, the illustrious Burke, the unrivaled prophet of politics, as he is sometimes called, described many years ago a crowd of American Tartars armed with the pike and the saber, pouring from the west over the Alleghanies, and sweeping away the wealth and population of our eastern cities, grown indolent and defenseless by the natural course of popular government, and profligate prosperity. So that's saying some American Tartars came pouring from the west, so obviously referring to Indians as American Tartars, flooding over to the west, and they swept away wealth and population from some of the eastern cities. This one, from 1848, it says, Mr. Thorpe, upon authority of Colonel Donovan, thus alludes to this tribe of American Tartars. The Navajo Indians are a warlike people, have no towns, houses, or lodges. They live in the open air or on horseback, and are remarkably wealthy, having immense herds of horses, cattle, and sheep. They are celebrated for their intelligence and good order. They treat their women with great attention, consider them equals, and relieve them from the drudgery of menial work. They are handsome, well-made, and in every respect a highly civilized people, being as a nation of a higher order of beings than the mass of their neighbors, the Mexicans. And this one from around 1848-ish, it's another Massachusetts Quarterly Review, so again, reviewing books. I think this was reviewing a historical book that was released. So it goes, our people is the most singular people under the heavens. They are ready to run anywhere and to run through everything. This Antony, gyrating about these pampas, now exhibiting a magic lantern to keep himself from starving, with my friend Crosby, at another moment in a retreat like a whirlwind, with whole hordes of South American Tartars after his emaciated skeleton, next thing slumping into a dirty dungeon, tomorrow strapping it across the dizzy heaven-kissing Cordilleras. I'm going to be honest, that felt like I was just reading the scribblings of a madman, but the fact that it mentions South American Tartars is rather curious, because again, connected to the old Peruvian kingdom. Did the Tartars go over, like we've heard? It's very possible. And finally, absolutely nothing to do with actual American Tartars, but in 1938, I find it quite interesting that there was a synthetic organic chemical company actually called American Tartars Corp. So yeah, I thought that was quite cool, actually called American Tartars Corp. The weird things you come across, eh? But anyway, I think I'll call that the end of the video, because it's been quite a long one. We've gone into almost every American Tartarian document I can find. We did have some that we could delve deeper into, which I think we might have to in separate videos, but I think we tackled that well today, and I'd love to hear your opinions down below. What do you think was going on there? I think, my personal opinion, I think it's likely that the Chinese were moving over to America quite often. I think if ancient people were making those journeys on boats, I think the Chinese were very clearly able to do it. The ancient Chinese, we saw the Fusang, they're talking about it. We know the Tartars had a navy. There's stories about Hakata apparently going to North America. That's possible. Maybe it was the Quivira. Maybe we're talking about Alaska. Maybe they crossed over there. I'm not exactly sure. But I think the evidence does suggest that people in the 1800s, at least, definitely believed that the Indians were connected to the Tartars. A lot of learned people do believe that. DNA-wise, they do descend from the same people, but again, they say thousands of years ago. They say there haven't been any crossings since. I think the most recent crossings would be, circa 5,000 years ago, something like that. But why wouldn't they have been able to do it since that? It doesn't really make sense. So whether Kublai Khan's men did land in Peru and form the Peruvian Empire? Maybe. Are the Aztecs connected? Maybe. Was there a West Coast kingdom of Tartars? And then, of course, we heard about the Tartars that were fighting against the Malays and apparently wiped them out in America and then just became the dominant force. So, what do you guys think to that? We're going to be having a look at something somebody sent me, which is apparently iced over canals and possibly ruins buried under the ice in Greenland. So we're going to be having a look at that, as well as some old maps of Greenland. So once again, this is none of my research. This has been sent to me by somebody else. So we're just going to be having a look over it, and you can make up your own minds and tell me what you think in the comments down below. So first things first, we're going to have a look at what Greenland looks like on these different satellite images. So we've got this from Bing. This is the Bing satellite imagery. We can see Greenland here. It's pretty much just covered in ice. Aside from the odd sections like down here, we can see that the whole thing is pretty much covered with ice. Over here we've got some areas where doesn't seem to be any, but generally the whole thing is covered with ice. Now this is from Yandex, the same thing really, except we see more ice in the northern regions, so perhaps these satellite images were taken at a different time, although look at that, very strange. Not put much effort into that. And down here we can see the proper satellite imagery, but we can see that it's covered in ice. The Google Maps version, we can see the same thing. Once again up here, melted ice, but the whole thing generally covered in ice. And the final one is ArcGIS, and we can see again the same thing that we're seeing, absolutely covered in ice. A bit more detail up here. And finally on Google Earth, we can zoom in, and once again it is just completely flat, and you can't really make out anything. Look at that. So there's not much structure going. Oh, if we zoom in even further, actually, we do get a little bit of land. Not really much to work with, is it? As you can see, keep zooming out, and that is it. So it gives you an idea that you can't really get much information from using these maps, which is fair enough. They're not exactly going to have mapped out the entire snowy regions, but it does raise some curious questions about what might be lying under here. So how old is the ice over Greenland? More than 1 million years ago, frosty Greenland was ice-free. Its bare bedrock exposed for 280,000 years. The atomic isotope beryllium-10 told the scientists that the rock had at one point been ice-free. To gauge how long that period lasted, they compared the amounts of beryllium to quantities of aluminium-26. It appears at a 7:1 ratio to beryllium-10, but decays twice as fast. Quantity of aluminium atoms relative to beryllium told the scientists that once the ice cover melted away, the rock was exposed for more than 280,000 years, up until about 1.1 million years ago. So to summarize, the ice on the island of Greenland is about 1.1 million years old. The presence of ice-rafted sediments in deep-sea cores recovered from northeast Greenland in the Fram Strait and south of Greenland indicated the more or less continuous presence of either an ice sheet or ice sheets covering significant parts of Greenland for the last 18 million years. From about 11 million years ago to 10 million years ago, the Greenland ice sheet was greatly reduced in size. The Greenland ice sheet formed in the middle Miocene by coalescence of ice caps and glaciers. The western and eastern Greenland mountains constitute passive continental margins that were uplifted in two phases, 10 and 5 million years ago. In the Miocene epoch, there was an intensification of glaciation during the late Pliocene. Ice sheet formation occurred in connection to uplift of the West Greenland and East Greenland uplands. More information for the official history of Greenland can be found on the Wikipedia page or in other sources, but one of the most interesting points that it makes is this. The weight of the ice has depressed the central area of Greenland. The bedrock surface is near sea level over most of the interior of Greenland, but mountains occur around the periphery, confining the sheet along its margins. If the ice suddenly disappeared, Greenland would most probably appear as an archipelago, at least until isostasy lifted the land surface above sea level once again. So interestingly, they're claiming that we would have an archipelago, which is a series of islands, if the ice was to actually melt away from Greenland, because of the weight of the ice which has depressed the central area, causing it to sink, and if it was to suddenly melt, then supposedly we'd be left with a series of islands. Interestingly, if we turn to this book, The Anatomy of Melancholy, by Robert Burton from 1638, we can see written on page 67, this section down here, when the man is talking about different types of fowl, peacocks and pigeons, ducks and geese, swans, cranes, coots, water hens, all of these types of fowl that were coming, it says, that come hither in the winter, out of Scandia, Muscovy, Greenland, Friesland, which half the year are covered all over with snow and frozen up. So the point being there is that for half the year, Greenland is supposedly frozen up with snow, only for half the year, which is a bit of an odd suggestion, because as we know, Greenland is supposed to be the only permanent ice sheet outside of Antarctica. Now, if we come to this 1570 Mercator map, which shows the lands of Hyperborea in the center, you can see down here that Greenland is clearly marked. and appears to be ice-free, with mountains marked and many rivers, as well as towns. According to the official narrative, 3/4 of Greenland is covered by the only permanent ice sheet outside of Antarctica. With a population of about 56,480 people in the year 2013, it is the least densely populated territory in the world. About a third of the population live in Nuuk, the capital and largest city. The Arctic Umiaq Line ferry acts as a lifeline for Western Greenland, connecting the various cities and settlements. The image below should give you a general idea of how populated the place is, and where everyone is at. Greenland has been inhabited at intervals over at least the last 4,500 years by Arctic peoples whose forebears migrated there from what is now Canada. Norsemen settled the uninhabited southern parts of Greenland beginning in the 10th century, having previously settled Iceland to escape persecution from the King of Norway and his central government. These Norsemen would later set sail from Greenland and Iceland, with Leif Erikson becoming the first known European to reach North America nearly 500 years before Columbus reached the Caribbean islands. In the 13th century, Inuit peoples arrived. Though under continuous influence of Norway and Norwegians, Greenland was not formally under the Norwegian crown until 1262. The Norse colonies disappeared in the late 15th century when Norway was hit by the Black Death and entered a severe decline. Soon after their demise, beginning in 1499, the Portuguese briefly explored and claimed the island, naming it Terra de Lavrador, later applied to Labrador in Canada. In the early 18th century, Danish explorers reached Greenland once again. To strengthen trading and power, Denmark and Norway affirmed sovereignty over the island. Because of Norway's weak status, it lost sovereignty over Greenland in 1814 when the Union was dissolved. Greenland became Danish in 1814 and was fully integrated into the Danish state in 1953 under the Constitution of Denmark. If we come to this 1747 map of Old Greenland provided to us by David Rumsey, we can see clearly Greenland depicted here with some kind of strange passage through the middle, and when we zoom in on it, it is said here these straits were formerly passable, but now they are shut up with ice. So we have a strange passage going straight through the middle of Greenland which supposedly was passable. At some point in history, they were told, you used to be able to go through here, but now it's shut up with ice. We can see here comparing that map to a satellite image of Greenland gives us a general position of where this canal or passageway might have been situated. A zoomed-in image provided to us by the Stolen History Forum shows what they believe to be this passage going through the center here between these mountains. This here is a 1592 map by Vincenzo Coronelli displaying the southern tip of Greenland with no ice. It has 2 straits, or channels. Additionally, it presents us with an ever-confusing topic of whether Friesland ever existed. It's interesting to note the many trees that seem to be growing in the southern tip. This illustration is taken from the book The Description of Natural History of Greenland by Hans Egder and published by Philibert in 1763. Once again, we can see a canal moving through the center of Greenland. Another image here shows what would have been the passage going through the center again. And 2 more down south like we saw on the other image. This map is from 1770. Now of course we do have this older 1569 map which shows no canals at all, but does seem to show the mountain ranges of Greenland even though we don't have much detail. Another map of Greenland from 1818 has had the mainstream narrative applied to it. The mainstream narrative of course calls it the incorrect assumption, as seen from this, with a map of Greenland illustrating the incorrect assumption that the Norse settlements of Greenland were located in southwest and southeast Greenland. Many of the localities named in the Icelandic sagas are placed on this map at imaginary sites on the unknown east coast of Greenland. The map is from the second English edition of Hans's Description of Greenland, a slightly modified version of the first English edition published in 1741. The map of course shows the same things as we saw before. It is said that this strait was formerly passable, but now is choked up with ice, and of course ridges of mountains covered with perpetual ice and snow. But of course it is important to note that they only call it the ridges of the mountains. In 1888, Fridtjof Nansen, a mere biology student at the University of Oslo and an avid skier, organized a daring expedition, crossing the Greenlandic ice sheet from east, a mostly uninhabited wasteland, to west, where most of the Greenlanders lived, as opposed to the previous Greenlandic expeditions, which had all started from west to east. Nansen was not alone on this journey. He assembled a crew that included some highly competent and hardy men. From left to right in this image, we see Olli Ravner, Christian Dietrichson, Fridtjof Nansen, Otto Sverdrup, Christian Christiansen Trana, and Samuel Johansson Balto. It is rather remarkable that Nansen's initial proposed route was exactly where the above-mentioned canal would be. Mr. Nansen and co. were unable to execute the planned route, shown here in red, and had to settle for one that they actually took, in green. Is it possible that Nansen was working off information passed down to him from others, which told him of a strait which could be passable? Nowadays, scientists are highly concerned with how fast Greenland is losing its million-year-old ice sheet. As a matter of fact, it was recorded that in one single day, 12.5 billion tons of ice melted. It's possible our scientists will have some interesting things to talk about in the near future as the ice melts, and historians too. As shown from the section of this book published by the alumni of Marshall College in 1849, which says, "The researches in Greenland too have been greatly extended by the labours of Reverend George T. Joe-Jennison, where important ruins are situated. In Volume 3 of the Royal Society of Northern Antiquaries may be found a vast deal pertaining to this subject, from which it appears that Greenland too abounds in ancient ruins of much interest." So we can see in Volume 3 of the Royal Society of Northern Antiquaries, there are vast ruins. Apparently Greenland too is covered in ancient ruins of much interest, and we've never heard about this as far as I'm aware, ancient ruins in Greenland, which will be something important to look over. We do notice on the United States Naval Special Warfare Command, the anchor is actually placed just off the coast of Greenland, which some people have suggested is symbolizing something. So is that a message there, or is that just reaching? You tell me in the comments down below. And going back to the point earlier about Greenland's ice melting, so the suggestions from the authors of this information, what they tell us is going on is apparently something happened to Greenland maybe 500, 600, 700 years ago at some point in the past, but in recorded history, something happened to Greenland to actually make it colder. And they're suggesting that before that, people were living there, and yes, it was cold, but it wasn't permanently frozen over as they're suggesting now. And as a result, this melting ice is just reverting to the way that Greenland was before this event changed it, before this event made it so cold, that now all that ice is melting, returning to the ocean, and that it's all part of a natural cycle, which I think we could all debate about, but that isn't why we're here today. But that's what the authors of the article say. And what do you think to that? So once again, this was none of my information. This was coming from the Stolen History forums. So you can take it with as much salt as you want. I'd like to hear your opinions down in the comments below, particularly about the canals. Is it possible that there are ancient ruins? Maybe Greenland really was passable with a passage through almost the middle of it only a few hundred years ago. I mean, those stories have got to have come from somewhere, surely, or maybe it's all just made up. So you let me know in the comments down below what you think about that. If you'd like to support the channel, there are a few ways you can do. The best way, the way that I prefer, is if you join Patreon, because then you can come and talk to us in the Discord channel. But that's completely up to you if that's something you want to do. If not, then just like and subscribe, and that'll keep me very, very happy. So thank you very much, guys. I'll catch you on the next episode of Ancient Historia.